Hello and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls Dissected. We're continuing a 3-part series on how enemy detection works, one episode for each of their senses, and today we've got one that most players aren't even aware of: smell. If you're surprised that enemies can smell you in Dark Souls, you're not alone. This is knowledge that's more limited to data mining and modding because it's not a public-facing mechanic. To some players, its presence is so unexpected that I was even accused of trolling on a recent Reddit post where I was talking about how Seath detects you. And as much as I'm looking forward to linking that person in this video, I kind of get it. Smell is not talked about in item descriptions or acknowledged anywhere in-game, so it's more of a behind-the-scenes thing. Internally, the parameter is referred to as nose distance, but despite that name, that doesn't totally clarify its true purpose, in my opinion. It's not really that the developers thought logically about how well any given enemy should be able to smell, as most enemies don't have this ability at all. Instead, it's treated more broadly as a sort of alternate means of detection. What if the developers wanted an enemy to be able to know where you are without its other senses? Let's say an enemy can't see you, can't hear you, and doesn't have something going on like a special scripted event to force a reaction based on where you're standing. But the developers, nonetheless, still wanted that enemy to be able to find and attack you. What other options do they have? As it turns out, that's what smell is for. How does it work and which enemies actually use it? Well, let's get into it. Smell is used by every boss in Dark Souls to be able to know where you are at all times. We all kind of already understand that you can't hide from most bosses, although I think most people would assume that this was facilitated through some other means, like some sort of hypothetical event script or special AI commands that tells the boss to stay aggroed and aware of your presence. Now, event scripts are used to initialize boss fights, as they're typically unable to react until you walk through a fog gate or into a certain part of the room. But once the fight has begun, there's nothing special going on to keep the boss aggroed on you outside of its ability to smell you. The same way we have the ear distance parameter for hearing and eye distance for sight, enemies also have a nose distance parameter. A lot of enemies in the game have this set to 0 and can't smell you at all, but every single boss in Dark Souls 1 has this value set to at least 100, meaning every boss in this game can smell you from 100 meters away, and in some cases even more. To demonstrate that this is really how bosses work, here I've modded the Iron Golem's nose distance from 100 to 0. Now it has to use its eyes to see me like most regular enemies, and with hidden body cast, he can't see us and won't aggro until we get very close. Suddenly, he's not very boss-like without the ability to smell, and we can lose aggro again quite easily. What does smell do exactly? It's basically just another pair of really strong omnidirectional eyes with X-ray vision. It works just like sight, except there are no additional parameters for viewing angles, so it sees in all directions, and this sense isn't obstructed by walls or anything. Maybe then it sounds funny to compare it to vision, to say it's just like sight except in 2 major ways that it isn't, but I do mean it, and here's why. In my previous video, I showed how enemies react to sound with a caution state. But if an enemy actually sees you, it immediately goes into a battle state instead. Well, that was an oversimplification. An enemy can see you without going into battle immediately, depending on another parameter called battle start distance. When an enemy can see further than that value, it instead goes into a state called find. This is all to say that the reaction to sound is caution, and the reaction to sight is either find or battle. How do enemies react to smell? Well, here I've modded this Heavy Knight to be able to smell 15 meters away. We can see that it goes into a find state instead of caution, giving us our first reason why smell is much more similar to sight than sound, as it triggers the same behavior in enemies. And there's something else that backs this up. There are 2 parameters for determining how long it takes for an enemy to forget about something they were pursuing or looking at. Sound target forget time, which I talked about in the last video, and there's also sight target forget time, which is of course how long it takes for an enemy to forget something they saw. But Dark Souls does not have a nose target forget time parameter. It's just these 2 things. Does this mean that an enemy will forget about you based on smell the instant you escape their smell range? They won't. Here I'm going to backtrack out of the Heavy Knight's smell range that I modded in. I'm now more than 15 meters away from him, and he shouldn't be able to smell me anymore, yet he's still locked onto me. And we can see that with this targeting capsule drawn in debug. How long will it take for this to stop, and for the enemy to lose track of its smell? It uses sight target forget time for this. It's as if he saw me, although he definitely didn't, as I also reduced his eye distance via modding to make sure he could only smell me. This is all to say that enemies really do react to things they smell the exact same way they react to things they see. Unfortunately, this also means that I have nothing to say about how stinky the player character is. We don't emit a smell radius, unlike sound, and we don't leave a fancy scent trail for enemies to follow. As much as I would have loved to have shown some hidden debug draw feature for invisible stink lines that surround the player, smell is just a parameter that enemies have to be able to see you through walls, and from potentially much further than whatever their normal sight distance is set to. There's also no tools or methods for mitigating smell. There's no ring or spell that reduces an enemy's ability to smell, so this is where the developers wanted stealth tactics to be impossible. Now that we know how it works, it's no surprise that bosses were given this ability. But before we get to some of the weirder stuff, a variety of non-bosses who were also given a nose distance, let's take a closer look at how, exactly, this was set up for all of the bosses. As I mentioned earlier, all bosses can smell at least 100 meters away, and the nose distance is set to precisely 100 for all but 5 bosses in the game. A 100 meter smell radius fully engulfs most boss arenas, which is why you can never escape their aggro. For example, the 2 furthest points across the Orde scene and Smo boss room are roughly only 50 meters apart. But if you're able to fly far enough out of bounds and wait out the sight target forget time timer, we can watch how these bosses would lose track of their smell on you and de-aggro. Now, there's a few other parameters to consider here, which have to be set up a certain way in order to allow smell to do its thing. In the previous video, I talked about back home distance, which is the maximum distance an enemy is willing to engage in combat with you, even if they're aware of you. This and a few related parameters are all set to huge numbers for all of the bosses. Not that they needed to be this large, but this was just a way to ensure that they didn't accidentally set a smaller number somewhere that would override smell and allow a boss to lose aggro. So they set massive numbers to basically just get these parameters out of sight and out of mind. Or out of smell and out of mind? But we also have battle start distance to consider. For most bosses who have their nose distance set to 100, the battle start distance is also set to exactly 100. This means that if a boss can smell you, they will instantly aggro, unlike the modded Heavy Knight earlier, who just went into the find state instead. But there are a few outliers here, so let's go down the list to see what's going on. The Bell Gargoyles have the highest battle start distance of all of the 100 nose distance bosses, being set to 500 meters. I can't think of a reason why they did that. 500 is well beyond what any of their senses allow, but it also doesn't hurt or change anything compared to if it was also a smaller number like 100, so it makes no difference. This is the only time the battle start distance is larger than the nose distance for a boss, so the rest of the outliers have some weirder, smaller numbers. Gwyn has a battle start distance of only 30. It almost feels like they were playing with fire with having such a small number, because he does in fact start roughly 40 meters from the fog gate. However, his find state has him walking towards something instead of just looking towards it. So if you stand still at the fog gate, you can watch him do a slow walk for a little bit before the battle state actually begins, trying to get what he's smelling within his battle distance. I believe this was intentional, to give the player a moment to see what's happening before he suddenly leaps at you. Next thing down the list is the Capper Demon. He has a battle start distance of only 25 meters, but his arena is tiny and that easily engulfs the whole thing, so there are no worries there. Or that is to say, there are no worries from the Capper Demon's perspective, it sucks for you. And at the bottom of the list is Priscilla. Her battle start distance is 20. This also seems to be cutting it really close, but being centered in her arena means it's really hard to avoid that. We can just barely get over 20 meters away if we stand as close as we can to the exit of the level, which is hard to do without leaving the level accidentally. Once we're here, attacking her with a ranged attack causes her to not go invisible instantly like she normally does, instead needing to take a couple steps towards us first to get us within her battle start distance. I don't know if there's any cheese potential here, but there's probably not. A couple extra seconds of visibility likely doesn't mean anything when there's already better Priscilla cheese out there. So unlike the Gwyn encounter, where I can understand why a smaller battle start distance was set, I really don't know what the intention was here. I can't think of a reason why they'd give us a tiny space where it takes her a little bit longer to go invisible. It's probably just a bit of unintended jank, left over from repurposing this tower mid-development a bunch of times. But before we take a look at the handful of bosses with the larger nose distances, there's a few more things in here worth noting. Here's a complete list of all of the bosses with a nose distance of 100, and we'll find that Calamite is included in here. But like, isn't his arena huge? I figured the distance between here and the cliff at the far end has got to be more than that, and sure enough, that's roughly 175 meters away. Does this mean that we can escape Calamite's smell range and cause him to lose aggro during the fight? Well, the initial problem with that is that he starts the fight off pretty close to you, and there's no point at which you're going to be able to get more than 100 meters from him. He's going to keep up with you well enough to not let that happen. And even if you could get more than 100 meters away, his sight target forget time value has him remembering what he last smelled for an additional 20 seconds and will try to find it. So to de-aggro Calamite, we not only need to get more than 100 meters away from him, but we also need to keep that distance for over 20 seconds, which is simply not possible in a normal fight. But what about co-op? As it turns out, yeah, we can totally get Calamite to lose aggro on us without any glitches. Just have your co-op partner lure Calamite to the cliff while you hang out at the opposite end of the arena. If they hold Calamite's attention for long enough, when they die or black crystal out, you're too far away for Calamite to smell you, and he just kind of gives up and doesn't know what to do. This makes for a clear demonstration of how bosses really do just use a large smell radius to find you and stay aggroed, and without it, they often wouldn't. Sadly, I don't think there's any cheese potential here. I tried my best to use the Black Bow of Ferris, combined with the Hawk Ring and Feather Arrows, and I found that I couldn't get close enough to do damage. If you're very careful to inch your way just outside of Calamite's nose distance, the arrows can make contact, but they'll unfortunately do 0 damage while also getting his attention. And in his brief moment of moving towards whatever hit him, you'll wind right up back in his smell range. If you're gonna cheese him with arrows, you'll probably just have to do it the old-fashioned way of doing that before Goff shoots him down. Let's also talk about the other dragon, Seath. In my previous video, I mentioned that he doesn't use sound to locate you, which is an assumption based on the idea that he's blind. So some players think equipping the Slumbering Dragon Crest ring causes him to lose track of you, making it easier to get behind him for the tail cut. But this isn't true for a couple of reasons, the first of which is that he can smell you at all times and always knows where you are. If you thought the ring was helping and it looked like Seath was attacking somewhere else in the room, that was a false positive. That's just kind of how he normally is, and he can behave the exact same way without the ring equipped. It's not that he ever doesn't know where you are, it's that some of his attacks are very slow. Sometimes he'll target a location to do his laser blast, and by the time he does it, you'll already be pretty far away. And sometimes he just spams some attacks without being as aggressive about turning around to face you. So it can sometimes certainly look like Seath has lost sight of you, but that never actually happens at any point during the fight. Here's an example of me using both visual and auditory stealth, and I've also disabled Seath's ability to move even while his AI is active and updating. While I'm making no sounds at all, and his back is even turned to us completely, we can see that he never loses his target lock-on of the player. Not until we get over 100 meters away for long enough, which can't normally happen without going out of bounds. Seath simply always knows where you are, and that's why he doesn't use sound to locate you. Not that he can't also hear, he has the standard ear distance of 10 centimeters, but if an enemy already sees you and is already aggroed, they don't care about your sound anymore. Now, if you're still holding out hope for the idea that Seath being blind is validated by the game mechanics in some way, maybe you're thinking that he still technically is, but it's just that he's finding you with smell instead of sight. Well, would you like to take a guess at what happens when we remove his ability to smell through modding? More on that in the next episode on Enemy Sight. I should also mention that while both Nito and the Capra Demon can smell you, the other mobs in their arenas can't. This is why stealth works on these skeletons and dogs, but not the bosses themselves. Now, for our next couple of bosses who can smell even further than 100 meters away, we have the Four Kings and the Bed of Chaos's Fire Spirit thingy. These have a nose distance and battle start distance of 200 instead. This makes perfect sense for the Four Kings. Their arena is roughly 170 meters across, so they did what they should have remembered to do for Calamite, and increased their nose distance to make sure they never lose aggro. As for the Bed of Chaos, it's actually split into a few different character models, and only the fire part that attacks you after the orbs break is the part that can smell 200 meters away. The tree-like part that does the physical swipes and hand slams smells the standard 100 meters instead, while the bug at the core can't smell at all. However, with the Bed of Chaos being a boss that doesn't move around, the exact numbers don't matter all that much, just as long as they weren't very small numbers. I think the reason the physical swipes got the smaller, standard nose distance of 100 is because certain attacks happen based on your positioning and distance to the Bed of Chaos. You already need to be pretty close for these attacks to start happening. However, the fiery arms are the specific character model that is also responsible for summoning the fire pillars and fire explosions that can target you from further away. And while these happen a lot more often while you're closer to the core of the boss, they can happen, albeit with a much lower chance, while you're anywhere in the arena. The devs likely figured you shouldn't be safe standing still at any place inside the arena once these attacks are happening, so a larger spell distance was set for that. But this is also one of those just-in-case sort of tweaks to the numbers. 100 was already a large enough number for this arena, as you were never getting further away than that from the firearms. But I could see how a developer might have not been particularly interested in calculating or double-checking how far you could actually get away from the boss inside this room, and just set it to 200 to be absolutely sure they didn't have to worry about it. That kind of cautiousness being applied here does make it funnier that they forgot to do the same with Calamite. Lastly, we have 3 bosses where the developers simply decided to go all out and set a nose distance of 9,999. This means that the Moonlight Butterfly, Ceaseless Discharge, and Gwendolyn can all smell you from roughly 10 kilometers away. This is obviously another situation where the number absolutely didn't need to be anywhere this large, but instead of bothering to calculate the minimum number needed to encompass their arenas, they just set a huge number so the developers didn't have to worry about the aggro range. You can never really get that far from the Moonlight Butterfly, especially since it first descends into the fight without needing its usual senses to detect you. This is just a forced animation, regardless if it could smell you or not. But I could see a developer initially worrying about the distance here and just setting a big number to be safe. In the case of Ceaseless Discharge, this is another boss that also could have just been set to 200 meters like the last batch of bosses. It didn't particularly need to be 10 kilometers, but it did need to be more than just the standard nose distance of 100, as your starting distance from Ceaseless when you first step into the fog gate is roughly 172 meters. So the developers rightly knew that 100 wasn't good enough and that they needed a larger nose distance. Now, while Gwendolyn getting a huge number makes a lot of sense at first, let's take a moment to unpack what's happening here. The long hallway is roughly 1.4 kilometers in length, so out of anywhere in the game, going into the kilometers for the nose distance is the most justified. And if you weren't already aware that this hallway isn't infinite in length and has an end to it, I'll link to another video I made that shows how they masked the transition from the normal hallway to the boss fight version. But the funny thing is that Gwendolyn's nose distance of 9,999 is completely undermined by their AI. Gwendolyn has various instructions on what to do based on your distance from him, so how far he can technically be aware of you from once the fight starts isn't the whole story. Taking a look at the Lua script, here's where we find the various instructions for what Gwendolyn will do based on your distance, with different actions given a different weight on how likely they are to happen. For example, when we're over 12 meters but less than 25 meters away, there's a 40% chance of whatever this is happening, a 35% chance for this, and a 25% chance for this. The different attacks are being given different odds. But the important part here is whatever happens when we're over 75 meters from Gwendolyn. There's a 100% chance of this happening, which is an instruction to just wait. So Gwendolyn won't do anything and essentially de-aggroes when you're over 75 meters away, despite the ability to smell you. This means that this boss can be easily cheesed with arrows. While I'm far from the first person to discover this, in trying to look it up, I found that a couple of videos that recommended poison arrows seemed to come up first. But I'd like to highlight an even better option if you have a little more dexterity. The issue is that most bows and arrows aren't effective at this kind of range and will do 0 damage. While some players teased out a distance where the poison effect of poison arrows can still proc, it takes a very long time for poison to drain Gwendolyn's health. Instead, we can use the Black Bow of Ferris, combined with the Hawk Ring and Feather Arrows, both of which are available in Anor Londo, and with these items we can damage enemies from roughly 80 meters away, perhaps a little more. Now, the damage at the furthest distance possible is pitiful, but the thing that makes this cheese strategy both very easy and viable is that you can't really mess it up. It's not like you only have one chance at it and that Gwendolyn will start teleporting away if you get too close. To make sure we're as close to Gwendolyn as possible so our arrows start doing some real damage, we would actually want to get closer so that Gwendolyn starts attacking. Then we could back up to find the exact distance where Gwendolyn stops attacking, using this to tease out the closest we can get to 75 meters. And now we have bow cheese that'll work a lot faster than relying on repeated poisonings. I think I've heard about some way to cheese Gwendolyn through the fog gate as well. Leave a comment below if you know how that works, because I haven't looked into that yet. But while I'm not saying this is necessarily the ultimate cheese, with regards to enemy aggro and detection, this is the most relevant exploit to point out, as it highlights an oversight with how the boss detects and reacts to you. So if you had to summarize how smell works in the Souls games and when it's used, the simplest one-sentence explanation is that it's the system used for bosses knowing where you are and staying aggroed on you. Not much is obvious from the video so far, but there are some non-bosses who can smell you as well. So here we're going to take a look at everything else that can smell in Dark Souls 1. Anything not mentioned from here on out has a nose distance of 0 and can't smell anything at all. The female ghosts have a nose distance of 3. This is relatively pointless because there's not really any way to approach them from behind, and they're basically always going to see you first regardless. Even if you've cast Hidden Body, 3 meters is the same distance at which their eye distance would allow them to see you. So smell's a bit redundant here, and not how most players are ever going to be detected by this enemy. Though I suppose you could quit and reload standing behind a female ghost, watch them turn around and attack, and in that situation we can finally blame smell for giving us away. I wonder if it's maybe actually the baby smelling us. Creepy. The possessed trees can smell us from 4 meters. Considering how they're a non-hostile enemy, this seems relatively pointless, but they did want them to stop moving when we get too close and they spot us, and this was just another way for them to detect us. Though part of me wonders if being able to smell was part of another consideration that was unfulfilled in the end, because they do have some unused attacks, and perhaps smell could be there because of that. All of the drakes can smell us from 5 meters away. If you've ever tried sneaking up and were frustrated by them seemingly having eyes in the back of their heads, this is why that happens. Wisps have a nose distance of 8 meters, but the interesting part is that this only applies to the wisps that spawn from the Massive Souls in New Londo Ruins. The wisps of the catacombs can't smell at all. If I had to take a guess, it's because the ones in the catacombs come pre-spawned. With fixed spawn locations, sometimes with specific patrol paths set up, the developers could place them with intent and rely on their usual senses to either detect or be avoided by the player. But because the Massive Souls might move or get pushed around during combat, the wisps that spawn from them might wind up behind a pillar or somewhere where they can't initially see you, and so the developers most likely gave them a sense of smell to help account for that. The parasitic wall hugger in Blighttown can smell the player from 10 meters away. This is a curious one, because we can't approach it from behind and attack safely from here, so the intention to use smell wasn't that you wouldn't be able to sneak up on the enemy at all. So why use smell if this enemy can see you just fine from where it does attack you from? I think it's just a bit of extra assurance for the developers. If an enemy is perched up somewhere kind of high or weird, they might be concerned about that enemy's ability to see the player clearly. So smell could be used as a backup for being absolutely sure that you're detected. Then we have the dragon butts, who also have a nose distance of 10. In my last video, I talked about how they don't react to sound at all, but it's easy to mistake smell for listening when you try sneaking up behind them, and it fails anyway. The Titanite demon of the Undead Parish has a nose distance of 20, and I find this interesting because this is the only Titanite demon in the entire game that can smell. I think it makes sense because most of them can't really be snuck up on from behind, but with the non-linear layout that might cause a player to enter this room backwards, they wanted this one Titanite demon in particular to be better at noticing you when doing so. If that was the reasoning, you would think then that they would have wanted to do the same with this one on the path between the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith. However, that not happening here probably isn't good evidence to contradict my hypothesis on why the other one can smell. Simply because this one wasn't implemented correctly, and they probably weren't thinking about it as much. It's not supposed to respawn in the first place, and the way it does respawn is glitchy and weird. So when I'm saying, hey, they probably made this Titanite demon smell because you can approach it from behind, I don't think it's unfair to assume that they probably would have wanted to do the same here if it wasn't rushed. Next we have the male ghosts, all of whom have a nose distance of 30 meters. But for the same reasons I talked about in my last video, why rolling around in the pool of water doesn't make them travel all the way across the level to you based on sound, you won't actually experience most of the ghosts taking full advantage of their ability to sniff the player out. But it is still responsible for a bunch of ghosts coming after you through walls where they didn't initially have line of sight. Just like this very first ghost in the level, who starts approaching because they can smell you, not because they can see you. The most interesting one to me is this one that flies through the walls as you approach the second building. Have you ever wondered where it comes from? It seems most intuitive that it'd probably just be waiting on the opposite side of one of these walls, but it's actually set quite a bit further back than some of the other nearby ghosts in here. In Smithbox, we can see it here. It's underneath the floor behind the female ghost, where it's perfectly aligned with two other ghosts that pop out of the ground as traps. Its placement strongly suggests that this ghost wasn't meant to approach you from afar originally, that it probably should have sprung up from underneath the floor as you attack the female ghost. But without the trap scenario being set up for it, its ability to smell and instantly aggro takes over, allowing it to come after you from a considerable distance. In short, if you were ever surprised by ghosts in Dark Souls popping through walls at annoying times, and it wasn't like obviously a trap that was meant to work that way, you can probably thank smell for that. Now we're going to jump up to much larger smell ranges. The Hydra, Undead Dragon, and Burrowing Rockworms all have a nose distance of 100, just like bosses. I mentioned not being able to sneak up on the Hydra in my last video, and now is the time to provide some more detail. I mean, obviously you could never fully sneak up on the Hydra, it's surrounded by a lethal pit of water, but how close can you get before it reacts? The nose distance provides our answer of 100 meters, since you can't hide from smell. But if you're thinking that this is why the Hydra attacks you from so far away, smell is not usually the culprit, as it can also actually just see really damn far. It has an eye distance and battle start distance of 165 meters. However, when wearing the Ring of Fog, the Hydra should only be able to see you from about 50 meters away, roughly, and with Hidden Body, you need to get within about 17 meters from it. However, these stealth items are limited in their ability to help due to smell causing aggro at 100 meters regardless. I'm pretty confident smell was used here to counteract potential bow cheese aided by visual stealth, not letting you get close enough for your arrows to do damage without it attacking you back. For the Undead Dragon and Burrowing Rockworms, the purpose of smell is a little less obvious when the smell distance is far greater than the distance that these immobile enemies can attack you from. Just like Gwendolyn, these enemies require you to be within a certain distance or a region for attacks to start happening, despite being able to smell you from much further away. Once again, I'm speculating that smell might be used as a sort of safety net to make sure that if you somehow lost line of sight from the enemy, that it at least always knows where you are, so that when you do get close enough, its attacks are guaranteed to happen and that it can't be completely snuck up on. This is surely the case for the Burrowing Rockworms, some of whom can be approached from behind. Though sight could have been used to ensure the exact same behavior, they could have been given a 360-degree viewing angle and a larger viewing distance, smell was another means for having them know where you are and makes just as much sense for the developers to use. Now we have another batch of enemies who can smell 200 meters away. The Pisaka, the firebomb-throwing giant, and this one specific crossbow hollow in the Undead Berg. The Pisaka being able to smell is pretty cool. I assumed some sort of scripted event is what caused them to run up the stairs to you when the alarm is pulled, but it's just their ability to smell that causes them to find you. Though the weird part is that while all of them can smell you, not all of them will make it up the stairs. Now, I'm not fully prepared to unpack the entirety of their AI for today's video, but there's interesting stuff happening here. I started to pay closer attention to who could actually make it up the stairs and came up with a list of 4 different Pisaka types. First, we have the fast Pisaka. There's 4 of them who won't hesitate and will completely trust their sense of smell to make it up the stairs quickly to you. There's the slow Pisaka. 2 of them will kind of slowly make their way up the stairs, but they'll get distracted and often seemingly give up and turn around, only to remember that they are smelling something further up the stairs and then turn around again over and over. Then there's the stupid Pisaka. There's 4 that just kind of huddle around at the bottom and will never make it up the stairs any significant amount. And there's also the crying Pisaka, the 2 that don't attack at all no matter what, and will drop miracles when you kill them. In listing all of them out, I found that they're all distinguished by having their own NPC think param values, which makes sense, something's gotta make them react differently. When you look closely at the behavior of the slow Pisaka in particular, it looks pretty glitchy, or at least kind of sloppy, especially in the context of knowing that they are always aware of your exact location, but they somehow behave this way regardless. But what I find fascinating about this is that it's clearly not a mistake. Like, sure, maybe the exact depiction of this response wasn't as fine-tuned as it could have been. I can see the developers wanting to animate or portray this differently with more development time, but it's not like the developers screwed up their pathing. They already made Pisaka who know how to make it up the stairs without issue, so whatever they did here, it was on purpose. So I believe the actual explanation for this is environmental storytelling. We're witnessing Pisaka at different stages of losing their minds. They're all former maidens who were kidnapped and experimented on, turned into these horrible monsters. The ones that are crying haven't yet lost their original state of mind. They remember enough of their former selves to be sad about what happened to them. They have no interest in fighting you because they're victims and they're not violent, and their faith and memories are still intact enough to hold on to their miracles. For the ones that I called stupid, well, calling them stupid was very heartless in this context. They're further along the process of losing their minds. They're no longer grieving, at least not on the same level as the two crying ones, and they have turned more violent as they will attack you if you get close enough. But they're a lot more confused than aggressive, causing them to not chase after you from afar, despite being able to smell you and knowing exactly where you are from all the way down here. I believe the slow ones are much closer to having fully lost their minds, but they're still sluggish at pursuing what they smell, so they're not fully in it yet. And then the fast ones are a portrayal of the former maidens, who are truly 100% gone at this point. Basically turned into a mindless attack dog, just acting on pure instinct. While the two weeping Pasaka always stood out to me as revealing the tragedy of Cease cruelty, I now have a greater appreciation for seeing how the game actually portrays a spectrum of their diminishing faculties. I should add that the Pasaka's ability to smell the player from very far away is something that becomes apparent in enemy randomizer runs. I've been doing those a bunch recently, and I had a Pasaka replace the hollow in the asylum that guards your weapon. At first I was very surprised as to why an enemy was rushing me like that, but then I quickly realized smell was to blame.
What? Get me the hell out of here. Get me out of here. I know why that is. I know why that happened. I'm so scared. I'm so scared. I think for fairness, I'm supposed to use the dark sign. So I'll have to remember to equip the dark sign before you again. There we go. There was the real boss fight.
The firebomb throwing giant being able to smell also makes sense, as they wanted the giant to be able to know where you are and attack specific locations regardless of its line of sight. Though I wondered if that needed to be accomplished with smell in the first place, as it attacks specific regions and not where the player is standing precisely. But then I remembered that, in the unpatched version of Dark Souls, the firebomb giant did target your exact location. That makes the use of smell make even more sense. Before they tightened things up so that the giant behaves like a trap that targets precise locations, this guy did originally free aim according to his sense of smell. And for something completely out of left field, we have only one hollow in the entire game who can smell, and it's this crossbow hollow. But if he can smell 200 meters away, why doesn't he always shoot at you right away? Sure, he does have smaller battle start distance and back home distance values, but 40 or 50 meters still goes a considerable distance from this tower. It turns out that he's also like a trap of sorts. He starts off in a null AI state, and doesn't get activated until you either get within 5 meters of him, or step into a specific region, which is the staircase. I think what happened here is his line of sight wasn't entirely trustworthy, and he probably wasn't noticing and attacking players as they walked down these steps as consistently as he should have been. So he was given a sense of smell to be able to target the player, but then after making him able to smell, they also had to turn him into a trap that doesn't activate until you get over here, otherwise he'd start shooting at you through the tower from way earlier in the level. But once he is activated, this explains why he never loses aggro afterwards. I'm sure a lot of you have noticed the sound of him trying to continue shooting at you through the tower when he doesn't have line of sight at all. That on its own isn't the strangest thing, but if he was a normal enemy, he'd give up after 20 seconds of losing his line of sight. But we can stand here forever and he'll never stop shooting because he always knows where you are due to smell. Now, unrelated to smell, there's something else kind of funny with him that I wish I noticed and mentioned in my Invisible Walls video. In that video, I talked about why you can't shoot some of the crow demons from a distance when you probably should have been able to. And it turns out that the crossbow hollow can have the exact same problem with the player. The high poly collision of the tower, which is what projectiles impact, has a clear and open path through the embrasure, exactly as the tower appears to us. There's low poly collision that does block that opening, but since that's not what projectiles impact, the crossbow hollow should be able to fire at us no problem, right? But the problem with high poly collisions is that, with having a much higher polygon count, it's too much for the game to handle or think about high poly collisions for an entire level at once. So only local and adjacent chunks of the map will actually have their high poly collision loaded. If it isn't loaded, then projectiles do switch over to interacting with the only thing available, the low poly collisions, the ones that block his opening. It turns out that the high poly collisions for the tower unload when you make it about halfway up the staircase. So, standing right here, his bolts have a clear opening where he can still hit us. but just moving slightly to the right causes an inadvertent invisible wall to suddenly start blocking his bolts. Finally, we have our last batch of enemies who are given the largest nose distance in the game, once again at 10 kilometers. Or actually, 9,999 meters, you know what I mean. So why are there any non-bosses who can smell so far away? For starters, this was given to all of the invading NPCs. This makes sense because invaders should be able to hunt you down no matter where you are. Not that an invader can always navigate an entire level to get to you. You can get far enough away in a map such that they'll de-render and freeze until you get closer again, but it's not surprising that as long as that hasn't happened, that the developers wanted them to be able to always know where the player is. All of the invaders have huge battle start and back home distances to match, aside from Leroy, who had smaller numbers set for that. There's actually another relevant parameter here that I haven't talked about in any of these videos yet, which is max back home distance. Not to be confused with back home distance, which is how far the enemy can be away from the player before they give up. Max back home distance is, instead, how far the enemy is willing to get away from its starting location before it gives up and retreats. All of the other invaders have huge numbers for this, but Leroy also has a smaller number here, set to 85 meters. I believe this is because of his proximity to an invisible wall for enemies. We can't bait him to this invisible wall and attack him from the other side, because a little further up this path, he hits his leash point, which is set via max back home distance. So they generally want invaders to be able to chase you everywhere, but they decided to not do the same for Leroy, almost certainly to avoid cheese with the invisible enemy wall. But it's not just invaders who can smell 10 kilometers away. The moonlight butterflies of the Crystal Cave and the Hellkite Drake can do this as well. Once again, another situation where the numbers didn't need to be anywhere near this large, but it's also not going to hurt anything, so why not make sure the flying enemies who can get some distance from you have total awareness of your location. Now would be a good time to point out, though, that this is not standard for all non-boss duplicates of things that are otherwise bosses. Like sure, the boss version of the Moonlight Butterfly also has a nose distance of 9,999, but just because the Taurus Demon, Capra Demon, Pinwheel, and Sanctuary Guardian can also smell the player as bosses, the same is not true for their non-boss variants. They cannot smell you. And lastly, we have just one more enemy that can smell this far. An enemy for whom this makes absolutely no goddamn sense. It's the Tree Lizard. Why? First of all, they're traps that don't chase after you unless you knock them off of a tree, at which point you've probably already gotten close enough for them to see you and be aggroed towards you. Maybe the idea is that once they're knocked off of a tree, the developers wanted them to be relentless at chasing you down? They are shockingly fast. If you never tried running away from one of these things, it's absolutely wild. This is probably one of the least witnessed general enemy behaviors that isn't even like a rare attack or anything. But they have a max back home distance of 75 meters, meaning they're not going to entirely leave their general starting area because of how they leash, rendering the small distance of 10 kilometers completely pointless. Now, of course it doesn't actually work this way on a technical level, as the entire game isn't loaded at once, but if we think about the implications of a 10 kilometer nose distance with regards to the size of the game map, this means this guy would easily have no problem being aware of you while you're down in Ash Lake or over by the Bed of Chaos, which is incredibly funny to me. So while he's not the only enemy to have a nose distance of 9,999, it's easily the silliest and hardest one to wrap your head around. That is why the Darkroot Garden Tree Lizard is receiving the Smelling Award, for the ability to smell stupidly far for no apparent reason. And if this enemy wasn't already weird enough, here's a bonus fun fact unrelated to smell. The tree that it's perched on doesn't have something like an invisible platform to stand on, and it's not like this enemy can truly cling to walls. The reason it doesn't fall from this position is because it starts off with its gravity disabled. It's a simple solution for making it look like it's attached to the tree, but there's one small problem. If we avoid getting too close to the tree lizard so it remains still and doesn't attack, and you land an attack with a heavy knockback effect that it manages to survive, which can be done with a cast of force, the tree lizard's gravity will remain disabled as it's knocked from the tree. So you can have these guys running around floating in the air. I have to admit that I haven't interrogated the reason for this any further yet, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. These guys are certified freaks. We have one final and brief category of things to look at that can smell, and that is NPCs. And this time we'll take things in descending order. The giant crow also has a nose distance of 9,999. This is equally pointless, perhaps even more so than the tree lizard, being something that can't be hostile to the player at all. But when we look at other flying enemies like the moonlight butterfly and hellkite drake getting the same nose distance, I can understand it as maybe a placeholder or default for flying creatures. So while this is completely unnecessary, this still somehow surprises me less than the tree lizard. Then the stone dragon, Guinevere, Alvina, and Elizabeth all have a nose distance of 100. I'd like to offer this as potential evidence that the stone dragon was considered as a possible boss. When it has unused attack animations, and it also got an invisible enemy wall like other bosses, seeing the default spell range that bosses usually have here as well certainly looks suspicious. But this evidence is also on thin ice, considering that I just mentioned several other NPCs who definitely weren't bosses also getting a nose distance of 100. So even if the Everlasting Dragon was planned on being a boss at some point earlier in development, the nose distance could just be a coincidence. It is a Covenant leader, as is Guinevere and Alvina, so perhaps that's the common thread here for some reason. Maybe being able to detect you from afar was considered as a potential means for triggering some kind of Covenant-related disapproval?
What a fool we have! What a wretched fool we have!
But as for why Elizabeth can smell you from 100 meters away, I've got nothing. Maybe she just has a musk kink.
Thy scent is very human indeed. Come, thine aura is precisely as she described. Deep, come.
And lastly, we have Little Sif. Sif has a nose distance of 20, which is probably not how they would detect Manus. That's easily covered with a much greater eye distance of 70. But I suspect that, because of how there's no guarantee of when you'll summon Sif during the fight, and what position they'll be facing relative to Manus when they do get summoned in, Smell might have been invoked as a backup for being able to notice Manus. Or maybe the developers just figured a wolf should be able to smell. Not that they applied that logic to any of the other dogs in the game who can't actually smell at all. But maybe they just figured Sif deserved better? I have no idea. Thanks so much for watching. If you're watching this video as soon as it went live, or shortly after, I'm doing a data mining live stream of Dark Souls right now. Did you know that this tower in the Undead Parish has cut content associated with it? Here's an unused event region where stepping into the space would have caused some unknown enemy to jump down from the top of the tower onto you. I think it was probably a heavy knight, but we can't know for sure. Anyway, recently discovering this made me wonder if there's other weird, unknown stuff hiding in regions like this. The vast majority are surely going to belong to something obvious that won't be a surprise at all, but we won't know until we take a closer look. So the plan is to go through the entire game with a fine-toothed comb. Hot Pocket Remix, the creator of the Scorched Contract mod and the Dark Souls item randomizer, will be joining me live to help data mine and review all of them. I have no idea how long it'll take to do that. It should take multiple streams, but at the very least, the first session of that is happening shortly after this video goes live. So if you'd like to see even more poking around in Dark Souls, and what that actually looks like unedited, come and join us. I know live streams aren't what most of my viewers are here for, but if you aren't aware, I've recently started streaming regularly, usually twice a week on Thursdays and Sundays. I've since completed a mapless run of Dark Souls where I couldn't really see much aside from floating enemies. It was absolute hell.
This is really tricky. I might be screwed here, honestly.
I also recently completed a Spawn All Vagrants run of Dark Souls, where, without mods, we went through the entire game and brute forced a Vagrant at every spawn location. That was a blast, and a lot of people in chat got to see a ton of Vagrants themselves as a result.
5, 6, and a Vagrant. 6 drift items and a good Vagrant at the same time.
And lately I've been doing this honestly kind of horrible randomizer challenge that's oddly addicting, inspired by my friend Carl Germ, but it's also one that a lot of people in the community are doing. It seems impossibly difficult, so if you'd like to see me suffer in Dark Souls, you know where to find me.
Weapon at risk. What? Okay, what the... Was he casting acid stuff that whole time and it just wasn't, like, rendering?
But more data mining streams, challenge runs, and weird mod demonstrations will continue to be on the way in the future. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, come and take a look. A link to playlists of my previous streams can be found in the video description below. Or if that's not your speed, hope to see you next time when we conclude this Dark Souls Dissected miniseries, with part 3 of how enemies detect you, which will be on site. If you enjoyed this video, please consider doing all of the usual things that help. You can also support me more directly by becoming a YouTube member or supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/loserywall. I'd like to thank King Boar and Hot Pocket Remix for data mining assistance, as well as Samuel Diamond and Regal for additional help. And an extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier: Adonis, Aronar, Arsenal Bat, Baku Bread, Basileus, Bod Manford, Europa, Insieridable, Kakuruma, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Majalis Duo, Mango Men's, Matt, Pawn Theory, Piedfire Crest, Ronax, Zelther, and Zulam Near. Thanks so much, and have a great day.